club works towards making R and statistics more accessible. And in the past, we have hosted some workshops on basic and advanced statistics and R. So if you haven't already, I invite you to take a look at our website and our YouTube, where we have a lot of resources for learning R and statistics. And today we are very excited to be hosting Björn. Björn Siepe, he is a doctoral researcher from University of Marburg, where he is doing a lot of exciting work in psychological methods. His research focuses on meta science of methodological research, time series modeling, applied experience sampling research, and he is passionate about open science and making methodological research more transparent and robust. He is also a board member of the Open Science Initiative at University of Marburg. And most importantly, he is the co-creator of the openESM database, which currently consists of 60 plus harmonized data sets from experience sampling studies. The platform is built to make it easy to reuse data sets with consistent and detailed metadata standards. Uh, Metadata standards to make ESM research more reproducible and transparent. And today we are excited to be hosting him for this talk where he will cover how to search, how to filter, and how to make use of this platform to analyze multiple data sets from experience sampling studies. And he will be covering some practical approaches to modeling these ESM data sets from multiple studies. So Bjorn, without further ado, the floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you very much. Thank you for the invitation. I'm going to share my screen, and while I do that, I will already post my slides and the R code that I'll briefly show into the chat. You don't need to take a look at it. I think everything will be explained by me, but still so that you already have the materials. Okay, can you see me right now? See the slides?
We see the screen. Yeah.
Perfect. All right. Yes, today I will introduce openESM. Before I do that, I want to briefly give a rough overview of why we even use experience sampling data, for which the ESM and openESM stands. So why do we use experience sampling data or time series data in psychology and other social and behavioral sciences? So I think much of the science that we have been doing kind of rests on cross-sectional data, which gives us a lot of information about between-person associations. So what do I mean with that? Let's take a very simple example from the literature. Let's say you're interested in the association between exercise and fatigue of individuals, and you do a typical cross-sectional study. You ask 1,000 people, how much do you exercise and how fatigued are you on average? And you can see here that people who exercise more tend to be less fatigued on average. This makes sense, but would you now tell someone that they should exercise more if they want to feel more fatigued in the short term? Probably not, because this is kind of a between-person effect that you find, and if you're interested in the actual within-person effect, you need to gather within data that helps you obtain inferences at the within-person level. And for that, you need repeated observations of the same individuals over time. So now we see the same idea, the association between exercise on the x-axis and fatigue on the y-axis. But now for each individual in our hypothetical study, we have repeated observations. And the x-axis now shows, if you go further to the right, well, if someone exercises more than they typically do, are they more fatigued than they typically are? And vice versa. And now we can see that in the within-person perspective, this association is actually reversed, which makes sense. If I exercise more today, I will be more fatigued today. Both are very valid perspectives, of course, and both are very important for research. But as many people have rightly argued, is that this within-person perspective is often well aligned with the psychological theories that we have, because we are interested in, for example, if I intervene on a person, if I give them some therapy, or if I tell them to exercise more, what will happen to their within-person processes? So To test and understand the theories that we have better, we need repeated data from individuals over time. How can we get such data? Well, typically, we often do this under the umbrella term of experience sampling. Some call it ambulatory assessment, some call it ecological momentary assessment. Whatever you want to call it, it refers to the repeated daily data or data collection in the everyday lives of participants. And broadly speaking, there are two types of such data. One of them being more kind of quote unquote active self-reported data, which just means that, for example, you give your participants an app and you send them questionnaires multiple times per day and ask them, okay, how do you feel at the moment? Or how stressed are you? With who are you at the moment? So kind of just typical self-report data, but just at a very high frequency over time. And the other alternative is more unobtrusive or passive, if you will, to use sensor data. And that's becoming more and more popular because you can get high frequency data without participants basically having to do anything. What does this refer to? For example, it could refer to smartwatches, which track your fitness behavior, to smartphone logs, to microphone, to videos, to GPS sensors. So to any of this technology that we use in our everyday lives. And what I should add before I continue is that if you have any questions or so, please just post them in the chat. I'm trying to actively monitor the chat while I talk. So there are different types of data in experience sampling research, but as you might imagine, these data are very rich in the information that they can give us. And thus they are also being used across different disciplines within psychology and other social and behavioral sciences. Because I think sometimes a misconception that I hear with people who aren't that familiar with ESM research is that maybe this research mostly focuses on clinical or on affective research within psychology. But here I'm just going to show you some of the papers that are, or whose datasets are included in openESM to show you how broad this field actually is. So here we have a paper, again, all of these datasets being included in openESM, which focuses on momentary cognition and how you can predict it from these experience sampling data. Here's a paper that focuses on everyday helping behavior. Here's a paper that focuses on skin conductance and how that fluctuates in daily life. Here's a paper that focuses on workplace stress, something on child well-being during the COVID pandemic, body positivity, Parkinson's disease. So their ESM is also more and more popular in kind of tracking medical disease in everyday life and its symptom burdens. And here also on predicting alcohol consumption, and so focusing on substance in a lot of fields. But even if you haven't worked with ESM data, what you by now might understand or think is that it's quite difficult to collect these data. It's very resource intensive to collect these data. So ESM studies, typically, they tend not to have that large of sample size, both in terms of individuals, but also in terms of time points. So maybe to get the conversation going a bit, you can just post in the chat, what do you think an average ESM study in psychology, how many individuals are enrolled in such a study? This is based on meta-analytic evidence from 3 or 4 years ago. Just post any number in the chat. 150 to 200. 60. Okay, I mean, I kind of primed you by saying, okay, it's not that many, but 50 to 100. Okay, 100. I'll wait for the other answers. Okay. Yeah, pretty close. The wisdom of the crowd is kind of working. Typically, it's around 136.6 whatever participants on average. And then the same now, the same about how many time points. So how many time points do we have on average for participants? What do you think? So how often do we ask them in their everyday lives? Thousands, yeah. 5 to 10 days, okay, yeah. 5,000 observations. Yeah, okay, if you aggregate across all participants, that kind of makes sense. Typically, it's around 51 observations per person. And without doubt, this is still impressive, right? It takes a lot of effort to collect these data, but still, this is often not enough. on the side of individuals, often we want to have larger sample sizes or more diverse sample sizes to better understand, for example, how robust our effects are across different demographic groups and so on and so forth. But also on the times, in terms of time points, often we need a lot of time points to estimate the models that we need to really test the theories that we have. So while this is great that people are collecting this much data, ideally we want to pool these data from multiple studies to be able to get larger sample sizes, but also to investigate our research questions across multiple data sets. Because as in all of science, basically, rarely, if ever, can we answer research questions with a single data set. Okay, so how might we get there? And what are the issues in using data from multiple studies? Because luckily, people have started with the open science movement, have started to share their data more openly, for example, on the open science framework. But there are still some obstacles in using data from multiple studies, and I'm going to show you a brief, illustrative case study what these issues are. Let's take a very simple example. Let's say you are interested in the within-person association between positive and negative affect. So you're interested in, at the same time point, if someone has high positive affect, so if they're feeling good, does this also mean that they report low negative affect? Or can maybe both positive and negative affect occur at the same time point? And to understand this better, you run this typical experience sampling study with around 150 individuals, and you ask them some questions about their positive affect, you ask them some questions about their negative affect. But of course, these might just be students at your university, and you want to understand, okay, how does this look in an older sample? How does this look in a non-European sample? And so on and so forth. What can you do? Okay, you go on the hunt online for data sets. Maybe after a while, you read a random journal article and you see, interesting, this journal article, it covers life events, but actually it also has affect data that I could use. But then it is in some random journal supplement, and you're not really sure if you can actually reuse it, and there's no codebook available. Then you might look further, and at some time point on GitHub, you might find another ESM study, which covers personality, but still has affect questions. But here, the file names might be very weird. There's a lot of files, you don't really understand the column names. So it's also unclear how to use and combine with your data. Then maybe there's an even larger study on the open science framework where people have also shared their data, also asking about positive and negative affect. But here they do not provide a license. So you're unsure if you can actually use the data and you don't know how to contact the researchers. And maybe the typical example, some people share their data, which is available upon request, quote unquote, but then it's by some eminent researcher and maybe you're just too shy to email them. And even if you email them, maybe they never reply to you. So even if you were to find data, it would be usually take weeks or months to find data sets. Then you might miss some data sets. And then it takes a lot of time to kind of harmonize and clean them. And we wanted to bring this very arduous process down to something that's much more efficient and enables much larger research at scale by taking all of these openly available data sets and putting them into openESM and harmonizing them. So that is the gist of the motivation behind openESM. And what actually is openESM? It's, as we said earlier, currently it has 60 datasets, more than 16,000 participants, and more than 740,000 individual observations available. And it's currently growing. I'm currently adding another dataset, and there are others waiting for to be added. And the data is just experience sampling data with relatively minimal inclusion criteria. So we want to have at least 20 individuals in the datasets, at least 20 time points, and at least 2 self-report items for it to be considered typical experience sampling data. And as I will show to you live in a minute, we also have R and Python packages for you to easily access, download these data, and also to get information about citations and licenses, and so how you can actually reuse these data. And maybe you already have some ideas in mind, and I would love to hear more about your ideas about how you could actually use openESM. But broadly speaking, to categorize its use cases, we think there are 3 main use cases for researchers. First, this is substantive research. So this is what most researchers are doing. You want to test certain theories across different contexts, across different samples. you might be interested in the association between positive and negative affect and how this differs across age, for example, or across genders, or whatever you're interested in. So we can really test our theories across contexts. Then another part of research that has become particularly important for experience sampling studies is what you might call design or measurement research. Because often these studies tend to be very complex. You have to make a lot of choices. Which scales do you use? Which sampling frequency? How often? How do you prompt participants? And so on and so forth. So now you can look at how study results co-vary with these different design choices. And then something that is close to my heart, of course, you can use this to develop new statistical methods, but also to test how well they work across datasets. Okay, so this is the first idea behind openESM. Before I jump into a live demo where I show you the database or where I show you our website, are there any questions as of now that you would like to ask? Okay.
I would have a question, if that's okay.
Yeah, sure.
So I've already got the website open, and I was wondering, because when you click on every individual study, you also get a link to the publication, right? But if I understand correctly, is the data set that accompanies the publication, is it a complete data set? So for instance, even the variables that were not used in the actual paper, or is it only what is also available in the publication?
Yeah, that's a great question. Maybe I can just show this live, but
Okay.
the basic summary is it depends. So for some data sets, it's just the data that's available for the publication. So it's not all data that has been collected for the study. I think this is, I can't give you a number for how many data sets this is the case, but it surely happens frequently that people don't share all of the data. For example, they don't share many of the cross-sectional data sets. But for some of the studies, it's also all the data that is available. So it really differs, but we intentionally also included the partial data sets because we thought, okay, well, it's not optimal that not all data are available. It's still better than having nothing. And it's often still quite useful because the experience sampling items are still available. So you can actually reuse them anyway.
Thank you.
Okay, so speaking of the website, I'm now switching to the website. Can you still see my screen? You just give it a thumbs up. Okay, perfect. So yeah, this is the website. Okay, I'm gonna reload it so the animation is showing. Okay, nice. It took me some time. There are 60 datasets, as I told you about. Some more information on how you can learn to actually use our database and so on and so forth. But what I want to show you is an overview over all the datasets that we have. For that to happen, maybe I'm gonna zoom in a bit. This might be nicer on the eyes. And click on the datasets tab. Here you get an overview over all the datasets that are available here. So you have an ID, the authors, rough topics, and then some general information like how many participants do we have, how many time points do we have, is there cross-sectional data available, and so on and so forth. And then we could actually just scroll down, look through all of them, or you could also order them, for example, by the number of participants. Here we have some very large data sets, or you could order them by the number of potential time points that they have, and so on and so forth. What we can then actually do is just click on these individual data sets, which gives us more information about the specific studies. Let's just click on this one. So this is a data set by Westhoff et al. Here's already some information about where you can access the data, but I'm going to relegate this to in a minute or so. But then on each of these dataset pages, you have general study information and a link to the paper. And you have some general data characteristics, again, in more detail. And then crucially, you also have some information about the licensing and also where we originally got the data from and where the harmonized data, so the data that we kind of cleaned and harmonized, is available. And then sometimes also a link to the code and or the codebook. And then below, for each of the items, you also have additional metadata and information. So for example, we have information on the answer categories, the labels of the scale, which questionnaire this item might come from, and which construct we kind of think this item measures. So there's lots of information about all of these in there as well. And of course, you could just kind of scroll through these data sets one by one. I think with 60, this is still quite doable, but maybe it's more efficient to just search our database, and we've built some functionality to do just that. So maybe you say, okay, I need to have at least 30 participants for my model. I need at least 25 time points, and I want this to be at least a week long. Then I also want some cross-sectional data to be available. And I'm interested in the construct of, let's say, neuroticism. And if that's not enough for you, you can also say, I want any data set that has something social in there. So now we have all these search markers as you would have in online shopping. And as in online shopping, you can just click on the individual data sets, and then kind of, if you've chosen the one that you want to use, you can check out, basically, you can click on this selected box, and then we automatically generate R and Python code with our packages for you, where you can then just download these particular data sets into your program of choice. There's more on the data. There's more on the website, which I'm not going to show in detail. There's an about page where you give some basic information on how to cite and how to look out for the licenses that are available. And then on the documentation page, what's technical details behind the data sets, how does a data set arrive in openESM, and so on and so forth. But if you have questions about that, just ask me later. With that being said, I will switch back to my presentation, and I see that there's a question. Would you recommend letting the authors know we are using the dataset? What's your experience with that? So you are not obliged to do that. I mean, the data all have a reuse license, and the idea is, of course, that you can just reuse these data because that's what the authors allow. For me, I think for me personally, if I were to inform authors, and it would likely be if I focus on very specific data sets and I do maybe a reanalysis of original findings, then I would let them know. If I do one of these like very large scale analyses and I just don't particularly care about any individual data set and it doesn't really potentially clash with original findings because I'm doing something new, then I might not let authors know in advance, but I might just tell them afterwards. I think it's very hard to say. I also don't know the unwritten rules here, but I think you're in no way obliged to do so, and then it's just your own decision when you think it might be useful for the original authors to know. I hope that helps. Okay, so now I showed you a live demo of the website, and I also already showed you how you can generate code to download datasets. And now, actually, I'm not switching back to the presentation. Sorry, I am switching to my R. So this is my RStudio window. Again, the code is available online. You don't need to code along. I will just introduce some brief arguments that make it easy for you to reuse openESM datasets. So let's say you have installed our openESM R package. Again, you'll find information on how to do so online. Then there's a function that is just called list datasets. Basically, it's similar to what I just showed you on our website, where you can just get an overview of all datasets. But instead of doing so in your browser, you can do it within R. So what this does is that it downloads the current list of datasets, and then you can actually just inspect it within R. So this is basically the same thing I just showed you. Here's the first author, here's the year, then here's the link to the codebook, and so on and so forth. Here it tells you if cross-sectional data is available. So this is just the table that kind of populates our website. It just might be nice if you want to programmatically filter for certain data, for example. Let's say you look through this data and say, I want a particular data set. Again, you could do so on the website, but you can also just do it here. And to do that, you use the get dataset function. So here you might want to download dataset 0010. And if you do that, it will download the data from our database, and it will give you some general information about it. So what's the dataset version, what's the paper DOI, and then some brief information about the data. You can also do so and download multiple data sets at the same time, which might be more efficient if you're doing larger reanalyses. And then, kind of moving on, there are some helper functions to inspect the data set. So first of all, if you just look at the raw data, it will just be very much what you know. If you've ever worked with experience sampling data, you just have a long format. You have certain columns, like this is the ID of a person, that's the same always, day, beep, and then you just have the typical ESM items in there. But then we also have functions like cite, where you automatically get citation information, so for the paper that you need to cite here. And you also have a notes function, which gives you any of the notes that we think are important for you when you reuse this data set. So for example, here, well, this is part of an experimental study, and there are 2 study periods. These are information that we think are relevant for you when reusing these data. So this is just some of the basic functionality. We're currently still expanding these software packages, but this should be enough to kind of get you going for using these data. Any questions on this general functionality before I actually do move back to my slides? Okay, then I will move back. Here I just included just what I showed you in R. There's basically the same package in Python. So the functions have the same name. It's just some different syntax due to it being in Python, but you can also use it within Python if that's what you fancy. Okay, so now I basically showed you the final product, but I think it's useful for you or for us to take a step back and think about how we actually arrived at this final product and how our design process were to let you better understand some of the particularities of openESM. So first what we did is, of course, we needed to find all these data sets, but then we cleaned them. And what do I mean with cleaning here? Well, for example, we harmonized how missing data are handled. And we removed some redundant columns, and then also we gave standardized column names. For example, in the dataset just now, I showed you that there's an ID column, and it says ID in every dataset. So it's not sometimes participant ID, sometimes IDX, sometimes name. It's always ID, it's always beep, it's always day, which makes it much easier to reuse. Then we also tried, to the best of our ability, to harmonize item names across a data set. So for example, it always says depressed when we think the item measures depression and not sometimes depr underscore x underscore 11 or so. And then the hardest part actually was the construct annotation. So I earlier showed you the search function where you can click on, okay, I want things that measure positive affect or neuroticism. For that to be possible, we went through each item and then gave different construct tags to these items. So for example, for the item angry, we would say this measures anger, negative affect, and affect. So different tiers of kind of construct granularity. People will certainly disagree with these construct tags. It's just for ease of use of the database. Then the technical architecture behind it. So what actually runs what you just saw. Maybe I will explain that before I get back to the question in the chat. So what I just showed you is just basically mostly the front end on the left-hand side, which is the documentation and the website with search functionality. But what actually lives behind that is that most of the code and metadata that we have is stored either on GitHub and or on Zenodo. So Zenodo is like the European alternative to OSF. And it's very nice because it has the good DOI handling, very good version control, and so on and so forth. So the data, our harmonized data, are just permanently stored there. And then on GitHub, we also have version control, but it's also nice because people can just open a GitHub issue if they want to contribute to our database. And everything here, including the software packages, is fully open source. So the idea is that this A, enables community contributions, and B, this project could even continue if I were no longer to be in academia or so. I do plan on staying in academia, but you never know, and I want this project to be able to be maintained further. Yeah, so that's the basic idea, to be as open source and openly available as possible. Then the question is, will there be a lot of noise in the passive data collected since it's daily life physiological measurements that would need to be cleaned, or is it already done before they are uploaded in? So for the passive data, it also depends on the study. Typically, I think there's a mix of people sharing cleaned and non-cleaned passive data. Sometimes it's also pre-aggregated. So for example, you have, I don't know, heart rate data at the second level, but then the data that are actually being shared are data at the 10-minute level or so, because it's just too much data to be shared. So I can't speak of all data sets, but I agree that there's often probably a lot of noise in the passive data collected. But then it also, again, it depends on the passive data because it's such a large umbrella term. I think if you just measure something with a smartwatch, there's likely a lot of noise in there. If you have something like SMS logs, or nowadays maybe number of WhatsApp messages sent from a smartphone, which is sometimes also being tracked, then it's probably considerably less noisy. So I think it really depends on the field of study. Okay, so that's the architecture behind it. And one thing that this enables that has already been done is that people can just contribute their own data. They can read our contributing guide, then they go to one of our GitHub repositories, and they just open an issue here, and then they just propose their own data, which is very cool. We recently, or a couple of weeks ago or months, received a new data set on gaming and well-being in daily diaries with more than 443 participants, and I'm currently in the process of adding that. And this is just really the ultimate idea that we have with openESM. So if you ever have data and you would like to contribute it, please get in touch or just open a GitHub issue. So I already showed you some of the data sets. I showed you how to download them, but maybe it's useful for you to get a bit more of an understanding what these data sets actually contain. So here's an overview of all 60 data sets. And let's just focus on the left-hand side for now. Here on the x-axis, we can see the average number of time points. On the y-axis, we can see the number of participants. And then these bubbles are scaled by the number of variables in the data set. And we see that both on the x and y-axis, there's kind of large variability in data sets. But then there are these very large-scale investigations with more than 1,000 participants, which mainly happened during the COVID pandemic. On the right-hand side, you see the frequency of different constructs. So for example, 56 of the 60 datasets measure some form of affect. So this is of course dominated by popular constructs like affect or personality and so on and so forth, but we also have things like depression or other more pathological constructs. Then for the data and their measurement and sampling characteristics, on the left-hand side, you see the sampling frequency, and here we see that we have quite a diversity of the number of questionnaires that the individuals are sent per day, ranging from 1, so basically a daily diary, to 10 questionnaires per day, so kind of a large variability here. On the right-hand side, we see that the large majority also shares cross-sectional data, which is very nice. There are some data sets that also share passive data, but only a minority. And then roughly 2/3 also share like the raw times when questionnaires are being sent, which might be important for you if you're interested in very granular time effects in your data. So again, I think a huge variability in the types of data and the content of want to show you one example analysis to just showcase what is possible for with data in openESM and what can be extended into in larger scale analyses. And for this example analysis, I do want to return to the kind of simple example that I talked about earlier about the relationship between positive and negative affect at the same time point. So the research question would be, does high positive affect co-occur with low negative affect within persons? So if I report positive affect now, will I typically also report low negative affect? And there are some debates on that, if people can also feel positive and negative affect at the same time point. But we primarily chose this question because it's a simple one to understand and there's lots of data to answer it. And with lots of data, I mean that 39 data sets kind of qualified to answer this question, with roughly 8.5 thousand individuals and more than 500,000 observations. So this is kind of the largest study by far on this question. And we're not only interested in answering this overall question, but also in how strongly participants differ and how much the effect varies across samples. And then for the analysis, basically what you do here, but I will explain it in a bit more detail in a minute, is that for each individual, you have momentary correlations. So you can take the time series of each individual. Let's say I have 100 time points, and then you just correlate across all of these time points my positive and negative affect. And then you might find that I have a very strongly negative correlation. So if I do report positive affect, I typically report negative affect at the same time. Or I do not report negative affect at the same time point, sorry. And then what we can then actually do is take these as effect sizes and throw them in a meta-analysis. And then we can quantify the overall effect size, but also the heterogeneity across studies. But I'll explain that in a bit more detail in a second. And then we can do lots of additional cool sensitivity analysis. And overall, again, this is just a pretty simple question and research idea, which can be extended in the future to more sophisticated content questions. But again, just to showcase the idea here. And I particularly wanted to bring this example analysis because I think the structure of it and this idea of a meta-analysis really is useful for many of the questions that you might want to answer with openESM. To do so, I briefly want to explain this meta-analytic angle before I show to you how you can actually do it. And the synthesize effects across multiple studies, right? So you have some effect sizes in multiple studies, and you want to get an overall effect size, and you want to understand the heterogeneity of effect sizes across studies. And typically, you might often see something like Cohen's d, mean differences, regression coefficients, or odds ratios. But in ESM studies, these could be any of the characteristics of your sample that you care about. For example, for each person, you get a correlation between certain constructs, or you get some regression coefficients that show the association between my stress today and my depression tomorrow. So anything that you're interested in, you can kind of think about as an effect size. And then what we typically do in these meta-analyses is that typically you have different studies. I just took a random example here. And often we just have experimental studies. And then in these experimental studies, we might find a certain effect. And then we kind of aggregate this effect across the different experimental studies that we have done. But now we can actually just do the same. But instead of experimental studies, we just have these individual participants. And each of these participants just has their own effect, which could be the correlation between positive and negative effect. And we can treat this as one effect. And then we have many participants in these individual studies, and we can kind of throw this all into one meta-analysis and then get an overall effect across all the data that we have, but also look at how much do studies vary, how much do individuals within a study vary. So kind of the idea of a meta-analysis, but just for individual data. Are there any questions on this? I know this is a bit more technical, but still, I wanted to give you this rough idea for you to be able to think about how this applies to the ESM context. Okay. If that's not the case, I will again switch to a live illustration of how we actually conducted this meta-analysis for our example analysis in the paper that we did on openESM. And where is my code? You can look at more details in our paper for this analysis, but basically what we need here is just all of the correlations for all the individuals. So again, if I'm one individual, then I have one correlation between my positive and negative affect over the whole study period. And then we get a data set that, if you've ever worked with meta-analysis, looks very much like a typical meta-analysis data set. So we say, here's a certain data set, this is data set 0003. Here's the individual one in this data set. And then if we scroll to the right, we have what's called an effect size. and the variability of this effect size. And this is just the correlation. So this particular individual has a slightly negative correlation between positive and negative affect. So again, we can use statistical machinery that we already know from other research to answer these questions in ESM research, which I find very cool. And also, I just included some code here. We can use typical meta-analysis software. I think it's not useful to go into too much detail here, but we just say, okay, our effect sizes are just the correlations. And then we can say these correlations have a certain uncertainty around them. Doesn't matter for now. Then we say, okay, there are different dataset IDs here. So the effect varies across different studies. And then we can simply estimate this meta-analysis. The results that we have. So again, we threw all these more than 5,000 people in a meta-analysis. And the overall effect across all of the studies is an average correlation between positive and negative affect of minus 0.49. So it's quite strongly negative. If people report positive affect, they report less negative affect. Makes sense intuitively. And then on this right-hand side, we can see what you might have seen before in meta-analyses, which is kind of like a forest plot. And that for each of these individual studies here, 39 studies, you get an estimate, right? You get a point estimate. So for this study here, it was very negative. For others, it was more positive. And then you get an overall estimate, and you see the heterogeneity between studies and so on and so forth. And I think this is really cool to see how much heterogeneity there is across samples, but also the overall effect is pretty robust. Then what you can also do, what I'm not going to show for time reasons, is that you can look at moderating effects. So you can see that, for example, in studies who asked participants more often per day, they tend to show a more negative correlation. So if you ask participants more often per day about their affect, positive and negative affects seem to be coupled more strongly negatively. Again, just an example, but I think it's pretty cool because this helps us to understand, okay, how might design choices actually be affiliated with outcomes later. And then we also did some robustness analysis to show that, okay, this finding is robust across different modeling choices that you can do reasonably. Okay, are there any questions on this example analysis? Okay. Then again, feel free to use this example analysis. If you're interested in positive and negative affect, I think there are many questions that are more sophisticated to be answered here. For example, might this relationship be nonlinear? Might this relationship differ between student and non-student samples? And so on and so forth. You can just take these data and experiment for yourself. So openESM is out, our tutorial or our introductory preprint is out. What are the next steps with it? So first, our idea is to kind of involve other researchers, build more community around it, and especially expand also data diversity. Luckily, people have already contributed their data, but we're also very interested in other people willing to help with the database itself, for example. With respect to data and metadata, we also want to extend, again, the data, but also the documentation. Say, for example, you now want to run a study or you want to do a reanalysis and you're interested in if the higher financial incentives for participating in a study actually leads to some other outcomes. And we don't have that information right now in the metadata, but if you just collect that, we could easily add it and you can just contribute to openESM while reusing our data. And I think that's a nice opportunity for collaboration. And then also we want to extend the software and make it more easy to use and enable more functionality in our software packages. Overall, the goal is to turn this into something like a continuously evolving community resource for more cumulative ESM research that really involves the community and helps us to find more robust and generalizable results. As you might guess, this has been quite a lot of work, and I'm very happy to have had these collaborators with me, Annabelle Büchner, Eike Fried, Yongzhang, Matthias Kloff, Daniel Heck, and Jonas Hasselbeck. And I'm, of course, incredibly thankful for all the authors who collected these data and shared them openly. So please do credit them whenever you use the data. With that being said, I want to thank you for your attention. You can find the slides, the preprint, and the R code I just briefly showed you online. There's much more information on this example analysis. I just wanted to give you a brief introduction to it, but if you're interested in more details, either ask me or look into our preprint on the topic. And yeah, now I'd be curious to hear more. Do you have any questions, any suggestions for additional features, or any ideas that you want to do research on with openESM?
Thank you so much, Bjorn, for that amazing talk. You explained everything very well, and I am quite excited to begin using openESM. And so, everyone, please feel free to just ask your questions, engage in discussion. And in case you're not able to use your mic or something, you can raise your hand. I'll just